You may recall the three worldviews that I presented on Friday night, those of you who were here. And those three worldviews were, first was the medieval view of the world. You may remember there was truth and God at the top, and we're getting some slides going, but may need the screen, or they're going to be a little difficult to follow. Atheism was hardly known in the Middle Ages, but believing in God isn't adequate or sufficient to take human rights seriously, right? The whole Middle Ages stands as a testimony to that. It's not just secularism that's a threat to freedom, it's also the wrong kind of religion, the wrong kind of belief about God. And it's the belief about God that characterized the Middle Ages was that God spoke only through a select elite in society and in church. And you had God speaking his truths to popes and priests. Very good. To popes and priests and to kings. And the individual was very small and unimportant. And so here we're looking at the three views of the world, and what I'm discussing now is over here on the left-hand side, the medieval world, you see? Between 500 and the 1500s, truth and God mediated to church and state, by church and state, to the individual. And church and state cooperated together in a system called Christendom, right? Different than Christianity. Christendom was the church and the state working together to oversee and impose religious and civil truths on the individual, who was very unimportant at the bottom. And then we went over how Martin Luther, under this system, there was no such thing as rights, right? Where did your conscience come from? If your conscience was a conviction that you held before God, that you could stand up against the church and the state, it made no sense, because the church and the state told you what was true. So how could you have a right against the church or the state? So for 1,500 years, there was no meaningful conception of personal natural rights. All of this changed almost overnight, not throughout society, but at least in the world of ideas, when Martin Luther came along and turned this bottom triangle here between the church and the state and the individual literally upside down. So the individual leaps over the church and the state, because the priesthood of all believers means that the individual must speak directly to God through Bible study and through prayer. And at that point, the individual can have convictions through an understanding of God and truth that the church and the state should respect. And I would suggest to you, over a period of 200 or 300 years, it was this paradigm that came to define Western Christian Protestant views of church and state. Only to some degree in Europe and England, but most fully in the formation of the American Constitution. And when we go, some of us will visit James Madison's house tomorrow. He was the one that wrote, as I said this morning, that as we enter the civil sphere, we have to retain our higher loyalties to God, and therefore the civil state can't tell us what our religious duties are. And this was a very powerful way of understanding the world, of the important roles that both the church and the state played, and there was a separation now between the two. And this was our constitutional founding. This was what John Locke wrote about. This is what Ellen White wrote about when she talked about Protestantism and republicanism, that there was now a government, and it didn't stay long, that if it didn't go unnoticed that if the Pope wasn't the supreme authority in spiritual matters, then maybe the king wasn't the supreme authority about the way politics should work. And philosophers and political philosophers said, the group of citizens, in fact, should have rights, and the leaders should actually work for the group of citizens. And so we came to Lincoln's government of the people and by the people and for the people. Now, of course, we have the third and final chart over here. Our understanding continued to, some people would say evolve, I would say devolve into the relativism of the 20th and 21st century. lowercase t's. What's true for you may be true for you, but it's not true for me. There's no longer a belief in an absolute God who rules the universe and who reveals himself both through Scripture and nature. It's now sort of catch as catch can, and you work out your truths for you and your meaning of life. And the individual is still considered important at the top of the triangle, but not so important because there's no overarching truths, absolute truths about the individual being made in the image of God, for instance. So this individual soon can be overcome by the desires and wishes of the majority. Church and state are still separate, but the church is considered unimportant and to be sidelined because people who believe in absolute truth, like Christians, are dangerous and need to be kept on the margins of society, and the state becomes the superpower. You may have heard of statism, the rule of the state over the individual. Well, I want to focus on this middle category here because this is what informed our founders, both of our country and of our church, when they began to think about issues of church and state, and also more broadly about issues of rights in society. Somebody asked me a question earlier today about natural rights. What are they? How do they work? And it was somewhat fairly straightforward, like this. Why did the individual have rights? Because the individual had duties to God, the way James Madison described it. You have duties to worship God, responsibilities to carry out those duties, and therefore you have rights against your fellow citizens and against the state in those areas, religious freedom, freedom of expression, that relate to your duties to God. There was this reciprocal relationship between rights and duties. And Ellen White understood that people had rights, not just rights to religious freedom, but rights against society. And she said this: the Lord Jesus demands our acknowledgement of the rights of every man. Men's social rights and their rights as Christians are to be taken into consideration. So she saw that people had religious rights and civil rights, and these should be protected against intrusions of the government and other people. And I want to look at 4 areas where she applied these rights in her day for an understanding perhaps of how this framework might be applied in our day, and we can have a clearer sense of what it is there, what topics and what areas that as Christians and as Adventists we might feel comfortable in speaking out on. I'm going to look at 4 areas here: slavery, in the related area of racial discrimination, the poor and economic justice, and finally, family and marriage. So this is, the issue of slavery shows clearly her understanding of the relationship between rights of the individual and duties to God and rights against the government. Even before the Civil War, Ellen White called for civil disobedience, the breaking of the fugitive slave law. She said, the law of our land requiring us to deliver a slave to his master, we are not to obey, right? It's not just that you should be able to disobey, but that as a Christian, you aren't to obey it. This was a positive religious duty. And notice, this had to do not necessarily with religious freedom, right? This had to do with property rights and property values and issues of social and racial justice. This is the reason for it. The slave is not the property of any man. God is his rightful master, and man has no right to take God's workmanship into his hands and claim him as his own. When the laws of men conflict with the word and the law of God, we are to obey the latter, whatever the consequences may be, right? So God owns you, God owns me, God owns the slave that existed before the Civil War, and there was no right for humans to assert their ownership in place of God's ownership. Speaking of the newly freed blacks in the South, she said that the Lord demanded restitution from American Christians to relieve the necessities of this field. The Lord calls upon you to restore to his people the advantages of which they have so long been denied. Now you can see that she's calling on the relationships that existed before slavery. It wasn't just enough to free the slave. Rather, there had existed a relationship for decades, for centuries, where one group of people had taken advantage of and benefited immorally from the forced labor and servitude of another group of people. And when that situation came to an end, it didn't mean that the moral obligations ended, but there continued to be, under this system of natural law and natural rights, the right and the duty of those who had benefited to provide restitution, restoration, if you will. She says this, "Are we not under even greater obligation to labor for the colored people than for those who have been more highly favored? Who is it that held these people in servitude? Who kept them in ignorance and pursued a course to debase and brutalize them, forcing them to disregard the law of marriage, breaking up the family relation, tearing wife from husband and husband from wife?" You know, sometimes you hear the phrase, well, slavery, we're still talking about that. That was over 175 years ago. And yet when you destroy someone's culture, destroy someone's family relationships, that's not something that recovers in even a generation or two. And if you think about it, while slavery was over 175 years ago, remnants of slavery existed during my lifetime. There were Adventist institutions still officially discriminating and not allowing blacks in until the late 1960s, when it was reversed by the federal government. If the race is backward, who made them so? Is there not much due to them from the white people? After so great a wrong has been done to them, should not an earnest effort be made to lift them up? William Faulkner says the past is not dead, it is not even past. And as a historian, I've become more acutely aware of how we live with the burden of history, and how inequalities that we create maybe decades ago, maybe a century ago, continue to persist, especially when those who've created it don't take it seriously and don't make efforts to undo it. Now, she didn't just talk about racial issues. She recognized there was a class divide in our country, right? And this is sometimes there's an unfairness in terms of viewing the only inequalities as being racial. There are also divides, there are poor white folk, right, that have been that way for generations. Now, arguably, they have fewer barriers if they are to seek to get out into larger society and get education and financing and other things. But in many places, that's very difficult. And Ellen White made it clear that Christian citizens had a duty to seek for changes in society to aid the cause of the poor. Without some restraint, the power of the wealthy would become a monopoly, and the poor, though in every respect fully as worthy in God's sight, would be regarded and treated as inferior to their more prosperous brethren. The sense of this oppression would arouse the passions of the poorer class. There would be feelings of despair and desperation that would tend to demoralize society and open the door to crimes of every description. The regulations that God established were designed to promote social equality. You know what she's talking about is in ancient Israel, you remember the laws that exist then? The gleanings that could take place? Poor people, it wasn't exactly handouts, you had to go and work for it, but you could go into the fields and take fruit and grain, glean the corners if they were meant to be unharvested. Every 3 years there was a special offering taken up for the poor, the widow, and the aliens, and distributed. Every 7 years, of course, the land lay fallow, and again the poor could harvest the crops from those years. Every 49 years there was a complete overturning of society as the means of production were returned to the original owners. The original families would gain back their lands. As Adventists, we have a strong sense of legal justice, that wrongs should be righted before judges. But it's harder for us to understand distributive justice, right? Is the playing field level to begin with? And yet the Old Testament is full of concepts of distributive justice. It seems to pay even more attention to it than perhaps restorative justice. This is what she says. Sometimes my students will tell me, well, but that was under a theocracy, right? God could distribute the wealth more equally. It's not up to us to do that today. Well, this is what Ellen White said about that. If the principles of the economic laws of ancient Israel were applied today, they would prevent the terrible evils that in all ages have resulted from the oppression of the rich toward the poor, and the suspicion and hatred of the poor toward the rich. Such laws might hinder the amassing of great wealth and the indulgence of unbounded luxury, but they would prevent the consequent ignorance and degradation of tens of thousands, patriarchs and prophets. She cites the Old Testament legal system and says if we passed laws like this today, it would be a good thing. It would help us. We would have fairer societies. You couldn't pass exactly the same laws, could you? Because we're not a land-based economy anymore. We're a knowledge-based, a technology-based economy. Probably the equivalent would be a significant estate taxation and then passing on those funds to provide for a much more equitable and fairer education of people at every level of our state economy. And I think in words especially relevant in a world we live in today where there is increasingly angry protest between left and right. We've had riots and fires in our cities. She says this, such laws would bring a peaceful solution to those problems that now threaten to fill the world with anarchy and bloodshed. She spoke fairly straightforwardly about some of these social issues, right? She didn't want to turn the church into a political unit, but she anticipated that church members and individuals would understand these biblical principles and bring them to bear in their lives as Christian citizens. Now I want to move on to a final area, that of family rights. And here again you see clearly this reciprocal relationship of duties and obligations, not just between God, but between parents and children is in this context. She wrote this, obligations are mutual. It is the duty of fathers and mothers to care for their children. But when the latter refuse to respect parental authority and to observe the rules of the family, they should be left to bear their own burdens in life. It's quite a strong statement, isn't it? And I don't think she's talking about 9 or 10 or 11-year-olds, right? She's talking about older teenagers, young adults, people who can fend for themselves. But there's this sense that, yes, you do have duties towards your children, but your children have duties towards you, right? They have rights, but their rights come with responsibilities. And should they begin to shirk those responsibilities, then as parents, you need to let them experience the consequences of their own actions and their choices, and let them realize what happens in the real world, and they need to live and fend for themselves in the real world, perhaps for a period of time. Quite a clear statement about this mutuality of obligation and rights and duties. She also got into the issues of temperance reform, alcohol prohibition. She spoke to the largest audiences of her life, speaking in favor not just of people not drinking, but of the passage of laws to prevent people from drinking, to prevent the sale and use of alcohol. This is hard for many Adventists who tend to think in libertarian terms to understand and appreciate. They're like, she just must have got this wrong. Well, I don't believe that she did that on significant issues like this. I believe that she indeed was an inspired prophet. The home of the drunkard, she wrote, tells the sad story of the evil wrought by the use of strong drink. Wretchedness and destitution reign, and often the wife and children suffer from cold and hunger. But despite of this invasion of the family unit, the liquor traffic is legalized. Heaven sees it all. God keeps a record of the men robbed of their reason and the homes made wretched by the use of alcohol. So there's a very interesting series of relationships here, right? That men have an obligation and a duty to take care of their wives and children, and the alcohol companies are interfering in this sacred relationship and disrupting it. Therefore, the government has a duty and a right to restrain the alcohol companies from engaging in this kind of conduct. And it's not only perfectly acceptable, but a duty of the Christian, she would say, to help the government and support the government in restraining these evildoers from disrupting these sacred family relationships. Right? Do you see that relationship between rights and responsibilities, between the moral makeup of our society, and how alcohol may have to do with your relationship to God, but it also very much has to do with your relationship with your fellow man and your family. And therefore, it is appropriate for the government to get involved and for Christians to support the government getting involved. She went so far as preaching that Adventists should go and vote for such laws and those supporting them, even if the elections were on the Sabbath day. This comes from a sermon she gave in Battle Creek, where the liquor interests had engineered the elections to take place on Saturday because they believed that Adventists would stay home and wouldn't vote, or they'd go to church and wouldn't vote. And Ellen White was one step ahead of them. She said, you have a religious duty, even on the Sabbath, to go and vote to protect people from the evil of liquor. Marriage. We don't know, well, I think we do know. We don't have on record anything that Ellen White said about same-sex marriage, because such a thing was not envisioned before the end of the 20th century. But we do have some comments she made about the change of marriage in the French Revolution. And this is very instructive because really it's the ideology of the French Revolution that we see unfolding before us in the rise of secularism in the United States. You might think of alluded to this on Friday, the King of the North being religious extremism, medieval Christendom. And I believe the King of the South, there's a certain amount of discussion in our church, but Ellen White says the force of the South is Egypt, and Egypt stands for atheism, secularism, a denial of the true God. And these were the forces of the French Revolution. And that's where marriage began to be redefined. Homosexuality was decriminalized at that point in the French Revolution. And it began its trip to becoming a right in our modern society. But they changed marriage to make it essentially a no-fault divorce, right? That it became a civil contract that didn't have any greater or more enduring, transcendent value. And she quotes a Christian historian, quotes him approvingly, this way: intimately connected with these laws of revolutionary France affecting religion was that which reduced the union of marriage, the permanence of which leads most strongly to the consolidation of society, to the state of a mere civil contract of a transitory character, which any two persons might engage in and cast loose at pleasure. You notice she focuses on the importance of marriage, not just to God, but to the permanence and the consolidation of civil society, right? This is a teaching of the natural law, not just of the first table, but the second table of God's commandments, and therefore everyone everywhere can see its importance or can understand it. And this is essentially no-fault divorce she's describing. Now, what does she say about it? Does she say, but the state shouldn't be involved in marriage anyway, or you can't impose a Christian view of marriage on a civil society, or... No, this is what she said. If fiends, and fiends is demons, not friends, right? If fiends had set themselves to work to discover a mode of most effectually destroying whatever is venerable, graceful, or permanent in domestic life, they could not have invented a more effectual plan than the degradation of marriage, right? And this isn't about marriage in the church. This is about marriage in society. So I think it's pretty clear that she would continue to have strong feelings about marriage in our own day and age. The sacrament of sodomy, the sacrament of adultery, she quoted about that. And she talked about the sodomite practices which brought the judgment of God upon the world. She's clearly referring to homosexual practice. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So while God and the civil state allow a certain freedom for people to choose moral wrongs, and we should have freedoms to do things that are wrong. God did this in the Garden of Eden, didn't he? He set up a tree. He didn't put a fence around it. You had the freedom to do something that was wrong. But there is no natural right to participate in such wrongs. You see the difference between the two? It's one thing if I let you free to pursue some course that might be destructive and unhealthy and immoral. But when you say you have a right to do something, it means that you can insist that I aid or help you achieve that course of action. And in some ways, this is what's happening with the Baker case, right? Jack Phillips isn't saying, I'm not going to give you the freedom to get married. He says, you have the moral right to make these choices, but there can be no obligation on me to aid, affirm, and celebrate this with you. That is going too far. Under the framework of rights and duties outlined above, one can see an argument that the state should give freedom to allow consenting adults to engage in sexual behaviors that don't impact others. Decriminalizing homosexual behavior seems consistent with the freedom that God extends us. But that is a far cry from insisting that alternate sexual units have a right to demand from the state and all other citizens full recognition and support of this behavior as a positive public good and as a good place to raise children. Because you understand, don't you, that the only way that children can be produced is through a heterosexual coupling, right? And so for gay couples to have children isn't a natural right. It's something that they have to get someone else to give to them. They have to invoke the power of the state in some way to force that child to be part of that unit. This is not a natural right. This is something that would be created and imposed beyond that. So, in light of these observations, what are some areas where I believe that Adventists should have impact today? And I've chosen 4. That's not necessarily exhaustive, but they are things that are important and in our faces in society today. And there's things we can do in all of them. I think the issues of family, marriage, gender, and sexuality continue to be important. So Lincoln Steed and I, in our little panel discussion today, we may disagree slightly on how important they are. He agrees with me on the morality of these things. He just thinks that it's going to disappear in the next week or two. Or maybe I'm overstating his case, but in the next few months, the next year. And I just don't think that's true. We have Western Europe, which is extremely secularized at this point. Canada, people have been criminally fined for just expressing biblical views of sexuality. In Europe, a Lutheran minister went to jail for a period of time for preaching the biblical view on sexuality. And even in our own country, despite the election of a Republican administration and Donald Trump, who's promised to be more protective of religious freedoms, we still face great problems at the state level in many places in this country. And on Friday night, I talked about the fact that in California and at least 12 other states, Christian counselors cannot aid Christian young people in dealing with unwanted same-sex attraction. They call it outlawing conversion therapy, but really that's a smokescreen. Because underneath this law, which supposedly outlaws a barbaric practice called conversion therapy, where you might use physical intervention to change someone's orientation, did that occur in the 1970s and 80s? Apparently it did, but it also occurred for a lot of other mental health problems, right? This wasn't the Christians trying this new method. It was standard practice in certain parts of psychology. And no Christian practitioners that I know of use that anymore or these days. So they're outlawing something that doesn't really exist, but the way they're outlawing it means that appropriate counseling and positive psychological help in dealing with unwanted same-sexual attraction is also outlawed. So as I expressed, I can go to California and preach about the biblical position on sexuality, but my wife, who's a pediatrician, cannot actually help members achieve that. It's an incredible infringement of the rights not just of Christian counselors and practitioners, but also of members of the LGBT community who may not share the moral values that the media and Hollywood portrays the LGBT community as having, right? There are Christians with same-sex attraction who feel convicted that the biblical lifestyle is their pathway forward. And to deprive them of professional aid and assistance is one of the most intrusive events in American history in terms of religious freedom. And now this law is being moved in California, not just from young people and youth, but to anyone. So if you're an adult seeking this kind of aid or assistance, it will be forbidden you, or the professional will lose their license and otherwise be penalized. I think this has to do with basic freedoms to speech, religion, and association, and that we should be involved in this, that we should get on mailing list of Christian family and marriage organizations and work with other people of faith to preserve faith-based gender and sexuality standards. Probably the most prominent organization that deals with this is the National Organization for Marriage, NOM. And I get their emails, and it kind of keeps me updated on what's happening. I mentioned earlier today, military and weapons. Christian nationalism has crept into the American church in a significant way, and it hasn't left the Adventist church unaffected. And back in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, for those of you old enough to remember that, we had a proud heritage of providing alternate means of service. Some of that was in the medical help. I went to the Frederick Church for many years, where the white coats worked, allowing themselves to be experimented on to aid the war effort. But we don't hear much about that anymore. And the reason we don't is because there's no draft. So we did that when there was a draft, but when there's no draft, I think the church assumed, well, we don't have a problem anymore. Our young people won't be going into the military. Well, because we're part of the same culture, the kind of Christian nationalism that swept some of the other evangelical churches impacted our church, so we have more and more young people signing up. And I mentioned this in the service this morning, and afterwards, a young man who'd been in the military spoke to me, and I said, I appreciate your service. I don't think it's wrong for people to serve in the military, but you need to be aware of what you're going into. And he said, no, I wasn't offended. He said, I want to let you know that you're right. When I was in the military, I couldn't keep the Sabbath as I wanted to. And Adventist young people, this isn't a good choice for them. So why can't we bring back to our consciousness the role that we played in carrying out the Sermon on the Mount, in healing and uplifting and not choosing to kill? There's a culture, a gun culture of militarism and violence that is found throughout America, that is found, unfortunately, in Christianity in America, which has also impacted our church. We see these school shootings taking place. Is there nothing that can be done? Is all we can do is say our thoughts and prayers are with you? Is there no policy change that can happen? And I'm not saying we have to be against all guns, right? There's interesting stories about Ellen White and James White traveling in a wagon train. They were in charge of it. And at night, they posted armed guards, right? What was the faith of our pioneers? Well, they understood that sometimes God asks us to watch out for ourselves. In her writings, she makes the point of saying this wasn't about the Native Americans who were in the area, but there were cattle rustlers who were known to cause trouble. And yet that's quite different, I think, from insisting that assault weapons and semiotic, high-volume weapons should be available to everyone, everywhere, all the time. This is not in keeping, I would argue, with the teachings of Christ, and it's not just my opinion. The church has an official statement on this, the General Conference, on its website. You should go and look at it if you haven't seen it. Objecting and opposing to the sale of automatic and semi-automatic assault weapons to the general public. Can we have a voice on this, or do we just have to watch our young people? When I was in school, did you ever have to do duck and cover drills? And I guess there was the whole nuclear thing that happened before I came along. But it's scary. Kindergartners having to learn the protocol for when there's an active shooter on their campus, right? That shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. And don't we have a voice? Can't we say something about this? Wouldn't she say something along the lines of the alcohol problems that existed in the day, that were causing harm to women and children? Well, this is causing harm to women and children and men. Let's have some common sense thinking about this. Immigrants and refugees. Two issues have gained the attention of the church recently, and there have been formal statements about at least one of them, and a petition on the second one. You may remember last September, the DACA Act, or the Dreamers Act, came up because the president canceled it, and then urged Congress to pass an alternative, right? So technically, this should be a nonpartisan issue, because the president himself has said we should do something about this. It's about young people who were brought to this country before they had any knowledge or ability to make any moral choice about the matter, right? They were brought in as children by their parents. They've grown up here. They haven't really known any other country, and they were given permits to work for periods of time. And those permits, Adventists are here on that basis. And in fact, Adventist pastors work for the church under the provisions of DACA. These people, can you imagine an Adventist pastor, he doesn't remember the country he came from. He has a family of his own, children who've never seen this country perhaps, and now they're facing the possibility of being exiled to a place that none of them really know, from friends, from family. I work for the Parle department at the union, and I write letters for people who are facing the loss of their jobs, Sabbath accommodation we call it. How much more severe would it be not just to lose your job and have to look for another one, but to lose your whole place in the world, start over entirely new in another society? Can't we have compassion for this? If you go through the Bible, there are many texts about the way we should treat the alien and the foreigner. All the more so when there are relationships. Once you have benefited from somebody's labor for a period of time, do you not think that there is a sort of moral obligation that arises from that? Have we allowed ourselves to benefit from the labor of many illegal immigrants? This has been kind of, and I have some Republican friends in the room, so I have to be careful how I say this, probably many, a well-kept, maybe not so well-kept secret that with all this talk of border security, it's big business Republicans that have benefited much from the illegal immigrants that come in. And so for many decades, while there was a lot of talk about keeping a border wall high and strong, there was almost zero enforcement internally here. And so these businesses in America, we built our industry much like we did on slavery. Well, this time it's not slavery, it's illegal immigrants. But now, having used their labor, we're going to throw all 11 million or 12 million or 20, however many there are, just out of the country overnight. Well, we can't do it, and it's not practical. But should we even be talking that way if we really understood the moral arrangement of it? And I know we're Adventists and we believe in law and order and keeping laws, and people who come here legally, illegally, well, they should have no rights, should they? I do. I'm a lawyer. I care about the law, so it's not that we should disregard it. But have you ever thought through the Bible about, are there any illegal immigrants in the Bible? Maybe I should say undocumented aliens, right? There are no illegal people. But if you would define illegal immigrant or undocumented alien immigrant as someone who comes in or goes out of a country against the will of the sovereign or the civil authority, you have actually more than a few fathers or mothers of the faithful that did that. Can anyone give me any names? The children of Israel, right? There's like a prime example of it. Moses fled the wrath of Pharaoh. Abraham arguably crossed some boundaries and some borders where he may not have had full permission. Who? What about Mary, Joseph, and Jesus? Left the country against the will of the king and came back in a way so the king wouldn't know that they'd come back, right? Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't obey the immigration laws, but I am saying you should understand a difference between laws that are based on morality, murder, theft, adultery, the laws that are also based on God's laws, and laws that are based on public policy and consent and convenience, maybe national security, and there's some overlap of the two, of course. But the point is that certain kinds of laws, like zoning laws and certain kinds of traffic laws, some of those are based on safety, we recognize they can be violated if it's important to protect other moral values and interests, right? An easy example, you're driving your pregnant wife to the hospital, and if you drive 55, you know that you're going to have a delivery in your car. You go 75, don't you? Despite it being a violation of the law. Mary, Jesus, and Joseph knew they may have been leaving the country against the will of the civil authority, but they were saving their lives, right? It's an easy question. Do some immigrants come to America illegally because they think they're saving their lives or the lives of their children? Should we then be treating them a little bit differently? I think the other issue here is this separation of families from each other. It's their new zero tolerance policy instituted. It used to be that when you came to the border, you could seek asylum. If you were running from a well-founded fear of persecution or violence, the government would examine your circumstance and assess it. And it takes a period of time to do that. And during that period of time, they would keep the families together and then make a decision one way or another after a few weeks or a few months. I'm not an expert in the field, but I know something about it. And then they would either let you stay or they would return you to your country. But now the policy is, if you cross the border without a permit of some kind, you will be assumed to be a criminal. We will arrest you. We will separate you from your children. Your children will be taken away and put in some detention center somewhere else. And then we will evaluate. And it may take weeks and it may take months. And we then may bring the family back together or not. In some cases it hasn't been decided. This is a very real issue for us at Andrews University. We have faculty members who help at a place called Bethany House, which is a not-for-profit interdenominational aid agency that the government uses to house some of these children. And so in the past, they've housed them, but there hasn't been as a result of a traumatic family breakup. But now they're suddenly having kids whose parents were taken from them abruptly and suddenly, and they don't know where they are, when they will see them again. And they're having trouble running their schools because the kids are constantly crying. And they're getting infants as young as 6 months old who were breastfeeding at the time, and they're now having to wean and feed on a bottle because the mother is not there. Is this humane? Is this a way we have to change our immigration policy? This is a complex area. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the Bible dictates to us what immigration policy should look like. There's a lot that goes into it. But I think as Christians, we can maintain and insist that whatever changes we make, we need to do them humanely and implement them in ways that are not calculated to terrorize children and mothers. Can we say things on this? Well, as a church, the North American Division released a statement about DACA, the Dreamers Act, saying that we have the need to treat people who've been brought here fairly. And last weekend I was at Andrews University where there was a Hispanic young adult gathering, and several hundred Hispanic youth. We helped them put together a statement on both of these issues, including this discharge petition HRES 774. There are bills pending in Congress to deal with the Dreamers and DACA, but they can't get out of committee. But there's a bipartisan discharge resolution sponsored by both Republicans and Democrats that just needs a few more votes that would get these bills out and for a vote on the Congress floor. What's holding it up? I'm not sure, because even the president has said we need to do something to fix DACA. Can people of faith be among those who give it the extra push to get it over the edge and stop thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who've lived in the country, some of them nearly as long as I have, from living in a state of constant fear that they may be taken away? I have people come to me and say, what document do we need to write? Their greatest fear is the parents are captured somewhere and taken away, and their children are left on their own, and they're not given access to them. And this kind of thing does happen. Let your voice be heard. write something about this discharge petition, HRES 774. ADRA has taken on a position to help refugees. If you go to ADRA's webpage, adra.org /refugees, there's a petition that can be signed there. ADRA usually tries to clean up messes around the world, but it's becoming more aware that often it's more efficient to try to change policies that cause the messes. And so it's lifting its voice and trying to get Adventists to participate in speaking on behalf of the marginal. I wanted to touch on a final issue here that is sometimes misunderstood. I'm becoming increasingly concerned about the status of Muslims in America and in our communities today. Every country has a kind of outsider who's working to become part of America, right? First it was the Catholics, then the Jews. The Adventists were there at one point. But we have more or less successfully integrated. You don't have a Senate chaplain that's a Seventh-day Adventist without having become kind of part of the mainstream. And yet, our eschatology still tells us there will be a marginalized minority religious group at the time of the end whose religious books will be disrespected, who will be placed in concentration camps, and who will be viewed as bringing the curse of God on America. Well, there's a religious group that comes close to fulfilling that, but it's not Adventists at this point. It's Muslims. And there's a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in the evangelical Christian community in America, and it's spilled over, unfortunately, into the Adventist community. And we should know better. You might ask the question, if Jesus was telling the Good Samaritan story today, who would be the Good Samaritan? You don't even know any Samaritans, do you? Right? I think there's still a very small sect in Israel where there's a few hundred of them. But they don't mean anything to us, do they? But what did they mean in Christ's day? Well, if you look at the New Testament, sometimes we have the most hatred for people that are somewhat like us because they are misleading others. So the Samaritans were the ones who held to the first 5 books of Moses, who wanted to worship away from Jerusalem. And the Pharisees and the Jews thought that they were demon-possessed, right? This was a religion created by a demon. And you have to understand this perspective that they had to understand the power of Jesus' stories. So Jesus interacts with Samaritans a few times, the woman at the well, and then the Good Samaritan story he tells. Now think about that story for a moment. Who is the hero in the Good Samaritan story? It's the Samaritan, isn't it? And the power of the story lies in the fact, if you were just trying to say the Samaritans are our neighbors and we should help them, maybe you would make the Samaritan the injured person, right? And then you would have a Pharisee go and help him to show how Jews should really act. But that's not what Christ did he? He made the person who did the right thing the Samaritan. That's why the story was so powerful and objectionable. Because you're taking this person who was part of this demon-inspired religion, and you're not just saying he's human and your neighbor, he's saying you can learn something from him, right? And for a chosen people who are convinced of their rightfulness and who are convinced of the paganness of the outsiders, what greater heresy can there be? You can learn something from him. And it's ironic because Muslims have a very strong sense and obligation of hospitality. And I've had friends in foreign countries, in Arab countries, who've gotten lost and been taken in by Muslim Arabs for 3 days until they were able to find their way again. So I actually think there is something we can learn from Muslim hospitality. But more importantly, Muslims need good neighbors today. All right, this is something Ellen White says about the immigration into our country. We've tried to send missionaries overseas for years, but the Lord in His providence has brought the world to us. Now we have an opportunity to share with them the gospel. Now I'm concerned because in some ways the Muslims are becoming what the Jews were in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. I went to Germany last year and did a tour of Lutheran sites. And Luther, unfortunately, is known for his anti-Semitism. And on the corner of the church where he regularly preached, there was a carving high up on the corner of the church, and it was of a pig, a sow. And at the sow, there were some individuals suckling. And this was a picture of the Jews of the day. Now, Martin Luther didn't put that up. It was before his time, but he allowed it to stay there. And we all know the horrible story of the 20th century. German anti-Semitism and Luther's anti-Jewishness were actually two different things. Luther was upset at the Jews not because of their race, but because of their Jewish culture and their rejection of Jesus. In fact, early on, he wrote a book hopeful that the Jews would accept Jesus. And he said, we need to remember Christ was a Jew. We need to approach these people with care and love. But unfortunately, according to Luther, they didn't embrace his message, and he became bitter, and he wrote some hateful, spiteful things about them. But for him, it wasn't about their race. If they'd become converted, he would have been perfectly happy with them. But that was different in Nazi Germany. It was about their race. Remember, I mentioned earlier today, even if they converted, they were still needing to be cleansed. So these are two different philosophical systems, but certainly Luther's anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism did not help the situation in World War II Europe, and in fact Hitler and the Nazis quoted from him. But what gave me a bit of a start was I went and I saw this frieze on the wall of the church, and then I went into a museum in Berlin about racism in the 20th century. And there were posters and bumper stickers showing the new racism that existed. And one of them showed a suckling sow with Muslims suckling the pig, right? The Muslims were the new Jews of Europe and in some ways of America today. And there has been a real rise in hate crimes, in a destruction of property, in attacks on individuals, in the Muslim community in light of the heightened rhetoric over the last 2 or 3 years, based on many things said during the presidential campaign. This is a time when your Muslim neighbors need a neighbor. They need a friend. I'm connected with a church in the Michigan area that has developed a relationship with a local mosque. And I meet from time to time with the imam there, and we talk about religious freedom, and we talk about the Quran, and we talk about the Bible. And he's expressed a support for the American idea of separation of church and state. He was in Egypt, and he said the government there directs and suppresses the religious thinking of the imams. It's not the way it should be. He is developing a strong appreciation for what I would call the principles of Protestantism. He wants to come to Andrews University and study the book of Daniel at the seminary. This very week is starting Ramadan, and we have a group of us from our church that are going over to participate with them in the evening services. And then they come over to our church, and we've studied issues together like the Last Judgment. Do you know that we share a belief about that? About creation, we share a belief about that. Now, we're not saying that the Quran is a holy, inspired book. We're not saying there aren't problems. But we are saying we have people who need Christian neighbors and friends. And surely we can take on this role. And if you're interested in that, there's a ministry at the NAD with a woman who leads out in interfaith relations. There's also a group here, I was speaking with my friend Pastor Reed, who is helping some refugees from the Middle East. So I know that there are some opportunities for this kind of ministry in this very valley, and I would challenge you to undertake that if you feel called to it. Who is the good neighbor today? Now, I know I've touched on a lot of issues here, a lot of history, some philosophy, some biblical teaching and principles, and some hot potato topics. And so it's only fair if I leave a few minutes for those of you who have questions, even those who may have objections or arguments. I'm not afraid to hear those. I went to law school. I can talk with the likes of Jason Miller and survive relatively unscathed. So I'm certainly willing to hear what you have to say and think about these things if you so desire. I don't know if we have a roving mic, or I know there is a mic up here. Hello? So there's a question back here. Well, that's fine. I'm happy to take my own questions. Hello? Is this the yellow mic? Okay, thanks.
You were talking about the physicians and the psychiatrists being limited in counseling or helping those that wanted to have some help with homosexuality. Are they not looking on the other side that in limiting the therapists and the doctors, that they're also limiting the person? That they are abusing their rights to seek help?
Yes, I tried to express this. It's not just the Christian professionals whose religious freedom is being impacted, but LGBT individuals who may not share the same moral values as the larger LGBT community are having their rights to association, religious freedom, freedom of expression significantly impinged. I'm surprised there's not more outrage actually on the left-wing side of the spectrum. It's because there's been a careful demonization of conversion therapy. And everyone thinks this conversion therapy is like abuse and such a bad thing, so it's good that we outlaw it. But people don't realize what's being swept up into that. And so here's a statistic that should put this in perspective. So the New York Times, which is a pro-gay publication, acknowledges that 2/3 of the LGB community is actually B. What does that mean, right? So 2/3 of those that identify as an alternate sexual orientation are actually bisexual, meaning that most of them can actually have some level of choice in whether they behave heterosexually or homosexually. And it might change over time, it changes spontaneously, it may change depending on the individual. Well, if there is, and I'm not saying this is true for everyone, there's some people who are strongly gay and strongly lesbian, but there's a whole crowd where there's this flexibility. And if this is true, that it can change spontaneously or based on events in life or behavior, why couldn't it change or be helped to change a certain direction based on counseling and professional intervention in a way that that person morally wants it to go? So you're penalizing this whole community, which is most of the LGBT community, making them unable to receive professional help in dealing with this fundamental question in their lives. I think it's a great outrage.
This is more of a statement, but I would like your feedback on it. There have been instances in recent history where billionaires have sought to do good for cities, for causes, and given billions of dollars, all of which came to naught. And I say that to say it is good to do good. We must do good. But we must remember the John 15 principle. Before or as we go forward doing good, we ourselves must have an abiding relationship with God and must do it through God. Because if we go forward with the emotions, the passions, without that grounded Christianity, we run a risk of running afoul of those same principles that we claim motivates us to do good, because we could end up doing more harm to those that we're trying to help and even to ourselves and our own community.
Yes, of course. And everything I've said assumes exactly what you've said, which is the way I ended my sermon this morning, pointing out that all social reformers must first, through the grace of God, reform themselves and do these things from an appropriate motive and perspective. So thank you for that reminder. There's a...
You talked about immigrants and refugees. I would say most of us at some point have immigrated to this country.
In fact, all of us, except if we're Native Americans, are either immigrants or descendants of.
Right. And as far as our Christian duty, I believe in that we should help others. How do we deal with some of the refugee problems where we are bringing refugees in, some of the countries that are doing that, bringing refugees in to prevent them from basically mass murder in their countries, but then they bring in their own cultures, which are then completely opposite of the culture that they are trying to be integrated into, and so you have a lot of abuse. How can we deal with that as Christians?
Well, that's a fair question, and I think that we've seen some examples in Europe, especially in Germany, of perhaps being insufficiently realistic about trying to integrate competing or differing cultures. And there was bringing in almost 1 million immigrants in a very short period of time, a year or two. And there were some conflicts, including some physical altercations, some sexual harassment and assault that took place in Germany. And I think that, you know, the liberal secular mind often has some good impulses to do some good things, but they don't take into account the depths of human nature and the significance of cultural differences, and they may not do it well. America, on the other hand, seems to be the other extreme. Germany, a much smaller country than ours, brought in nearly 1 million refugees. America last year brought in something like 38,000, which is the drop in a bucket. And our capacity for bringing people in and doing it carefully and with socially appropriate training and so on is much higher than our present capacity. And this is what ADRA points out, that we are bringing in almost just about a third of what we used to do at a time when there is significant international refugee crisis going on. And often we tend to think, and here I'm talking about mutual obligations and moral engagement, why are all these refugees in the world? Why can't they get their countries together? If you study the history of the Middle East, both at the beginning of the 20th century and later towards the end of it, much of the instability and the problems there have been caused by Western intervention in pursuit of oil and protection of oil, and of course most recently the invasion of Iraq, which destabilized the whole region, leading to a civil war, leading to the rise of ISIS, leading to civil war in Syria, leading to... So this refugee crisis is hardly completely unrelated to anything that we've done. We certainly helped the dominoes fall over. And I would say that when the judge of all comes to rule on this, that there's going to be a certain amount of culpability that comes our direction. And for us to insist, well, we have no responsibility for these refugees and anything we do is out of the goodness of our heart, is to not take seriously the lessons of history or the law books of morality. But we need to do it carefully, but we can do a lot more than we're doing. 3 minutes left. So.
You mentioned about woman ordination in our church.
Oh.
I'm here.
Oh, here, sorry.
You mentioned about woman ordination in our church. Do you see any pressure on this topic from outside the church, like our culture, you know, the woman movement, like now the movement of the future is feminist, for example. Do you see any pressure from outside on accepting this ordination in our church?
Yes, I do. I think that there's a tremendous influence in higher academia in America from feminist ideology. And that has certainly infiltrated our society at large as well as the church. And it's not, there is a biblical feminism, right? And I'm supportive of the equal and fair treatment of men and women. But the fair and equal treatment doesn't necessarily mean the same treatment, because men and women are not the same. And this is one of the great pitfalls of secular feminist ideology, is that equality equals sameness. And so if we're going to treat men and women equally, then they've got to go to colleges together, and they need to be able to share dorms together, and in the military they need to be able to work in the same units together, and this is to somewhat overlook the different strengths and weaknesses of men and women. So have you noticed in the newspapers that sexual harassment and rape has been a tremendous plague in both the military and colleges, especially over the last 5 or 10 years? How is this gender equality and equal sameness thing working out? Very badly, I would say, because sexual abuse and assault increases, but who does it increase to? Is it equally distributed? 50% of men are sexually abused, 50% of women? No, it's like 90 to 95% versus 5 or 10%. And this is a real problem, that we have at sometimes uncritically adopted this feminist idea of equality being sameness. And I'm concerned that in our church, and there's got to be a middle road on this. I know I had 3 minutes and I'm at 6 and I'm going to take a couple more. But Ellen White said there should be women ministering in our church. She said where there's 1, there should be 20. She said we should pay them with the tithe. She had licensed women ministers in her day that preached, taught, did evangelism. They weren't ordained. They didn't play what Ellen White would call a headship role in the church. They worked with other men, preachers. But in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we lost sight of that, and we sidelined women, and we were wrong. And the conservatives on this topic are just as guilty of violating spirit of prophecy and scriptural teaching, perhaps, as those who want to insist on full sameness means equality. And those of you interested in the topic, my book on the Reformation and the Remnant has a whole chapter on this topic. And so we need to try to find this middle ground where we create many more professional women ministry opportunities for women, but we do so in ways that will work in other cultures as well. Because even if we ordain women here in North America, it's just not going to happen in Africa or South America or many other places, and yet we need women in ministry there too. And so we really need to come together in a way that prevents this issue from dividing us as it is, and look for common sense solutions that do put more women into ministry, but perhaps do so in ways that respect what many perceive as biblical teachings about men and women not being exactly the same, though needing to be treated equally. So how's that for dancing around the minefield of a rather difficult question? I'll perhaps end it there before I step on a mine.